Part 2 of our critical appraisal lecture series focuses on appraising pre-appraised evidence. In this first lecture of Part 2, Lecture 2A, we will begin with a brief review of what pre-appraised evidence is, and then spend the rest of the lecture focusing on determining suitability for pre-appraised evidence. Following this lecture, students should be prepared to explain why critical appraisal is required for pre-appraised evidence, describe how the age of the evidence impacts suitability, discuss the topic specifics that must be considered when assessing for suitability, and evaluate the suitability of a piece of pre-appraised evidence. Let's begin with a brief review of pre-appraised evidence. As you should recall from previous lectures, pre-appraised evidence is a category of evidence where an individual piece of pre-appraised evidence is itself a synthesis of a group of individual studies that have undergone critical evaluation by a team of investigators. What this means is that the team of investigators have already evaluated the individual pieces of evidence included within this larger synthesis for both quality and representation of the most rigorous research methods. When following the PET process of the Johns Hopkins evidence-based practice model, your first step of searching the literature is to search for pre-appraised evidence. If you find compelling pre-appraised evidence that appears to answer your evidence-based practice question, then your next step before doing a full exhaustive literature search is to appraise the pre-appraised evidence. Yes, you need to appraise pre-appraised evidence. Even though pre-appraised evidence has already been appraised by a team of investigators, you still have an ethical obligation to conduct your own assessment of how the literature was generated and reported before you translate the findings from pre-appraised evidence in your own practice setting. When appraising pre-appraised evidence, you will appraise both the suitability and the quality of the piece of evidence using the Johns Hopkins evidence-based practice model and guidelines pre-appraised evidence appraisal tools found in Appendix E1. These tools provide us with a standard and systematic framework such that your appraisal of the piece of pre-appraised evidence and my appraisal of the piece of pre-appraised evidence should yield very similar results. This does not mean that our appraisals will be identical. There is a level of subjectivity to appraising evidence. And that is why it is so important that you use these standardized tools to guide your appraisal. After you appraise the pre-appraised piece of evidence, if your appraisal has deemed the evidence to be suitable based on your evidence-based practice question, deemed the evidence to be of adequate quality, deemed the evidence to directly answer your evidence-based practice question, and the piece of evidence provides a clear recommendation, the piece of pre-appraised evidence can be used as independent support for decision-making. And what does independent support for decision-making mean? We briefly touched on this in the last lecture, but let's look at it in a little bit more detail. Within the context of the Johns Hopkins evidence-based practice model, independent support for decision-making means that a piece of pre-appraised evidence is a high-quality synthesis of the current literature available on a given topic, and therefore the piece of evidence provides a strong foundation for guiding clinical practice choices. Therefore, an exhaustive literature review is not necessary. The piece of pre-appraised evidence independently supports practice change, thus the term independent support for decision-making. However, you still, even with evidence that provides independent support for decision-making, you still have an obligation to sweep the literature for any publications that have occurred since the pre-appraised evidence search was conducted. This way, you will ensure that the pre-appraised evidence provides the most up-to-date information on your topic, or you will also consider the evidence that was published after the pre-appraised evidence. Before we do a deep dive into the critical appraisal of pre-appraised evidence, I want to emphasize the following note. A deep dive into the design of individual studies within a pre-appraised piece of evidence is not necessary. I kind of alluded to this on the previous slide. Pre-appraised evidence is called pre-appraised because experts have already evaluated the individual studies that made up the pre-appraised piece of evidence, and they should have used a critical evaluation schema. A schema is a systematic process and tools used by the authors to appraise the individual studies within the pre-appraised piece of evidence. Thus, the Johns Hopkins model, evidence-based practice, appendixy appraisal tools would be an example of an evaluation schema. Based on the schema used, the authors then should report the overall level of certainty, confidence, and/or strength of their synthesized findings. It is very important that you consider the level of support for practice change from the pre-appraised piece of evidence before translating the information that was provided in that piece of evidence to respond to your evidence-based practice problem. Hopefully, from the last few slides, you have concluded that it is necessary for us to appraise pre-appraised evidence. Our appraisal of pre-appraised evidence really focuses on two key action items: the suitability of the pre-appraised evidence to our evidence-based practice question, and the quality of the piece of pre-appraised evidence. In this lecture, we are going to focus on the first action item, suitability. Let's begin our discussion of suitability at the very beginning. What exactly is suitability? In the context of the Johns Hopkins evidence-based practice model, the suitability of pre-appraised evidence refers to the assessment of how practical and appropriate the piece of evidence is for your specific clinical situation. In other words, is the practice change that the pre-appraised piece of evidence is recommending appropriate for your environment based off of your evidence-based practice question? Specifically, we are looking at if the piece of pre-appraised evidence is recent enough to be relevant to your practice question, as well as if it is similar enough to your specific situation to be transferable or generalized, and if the piece of evidence provides a reasonable, rational, implicatable solution to your problem. The why behind appraising for suitability addresses three main concepts. First, determining applicability. When we have deemed a piece of evidence suitable, we can be more confident in advocating for applying the findings in the setting of our evidence-based practice problem because the setting and the population and the intervention are all either very similar or the same to our topic. Second, generating practice recommendations. A piece of pre-appraised evidence that is deemed suitable provides us with a consistent body of high-quality evidence. This evidence is in fact so highly regarded when deemed suitable that it meets the criteria for providing independent support for decision-making. And third, planning future projects. Pre-appraised evidence that is not fully suitable, in other words, evidence that addresses some but not all of the aspects of our evidence-based practice question, provide us with the foundation and rationale to move forward with pilot projects to test different implications in our specific environment. In order to determine suitability, we need to appraise if the unique aspects of our problem and our evidence-based practice question are being addressed in this piece of evidence. This is achieved through looking at the age of the evidence as well as the topic specifics. When addressing the age of the evidence, the natural question is to inquire, how recent is recent enough? The general answer to this question has usually been 5 years, but I want to caution you against setting 5 years as your hard and fast cutoff for addressing all evidence-based practice questions. 5 years is really an arbitrary answer to this question. To best answer the question of how recent is recent enough, you must first begin by evaluating your evidence-based practice topic. Consider if your topic is a topic that is changing quickly or a more static topic. Static topics are topics that do not have significant new research or publication surrounding them. When considering a practice change related to a static evidence-based practice topic, you will likely want to go back to the seminal work on that topic. Additionally, for static topics, older pieces of pre-appraised evidence will be acceptable for guiding practice change as there is no new or developing research on the topic. But be careful, don't just assume a topic is static until you have looked at the literature. Some topics are not static at all. Topics related to technology or emerging information are far from static and will require the use of very recent publications to best answer the evidence-based practice question and appropriately guide practice change. For some of these topics, even 5 years is too broad a time span to get the most up-to-date research on the topic. A word of caution when looking at the age of pre-appraised evidence: do not focus on the year that the pre-appraised article was published. Rather, focus on the year that the search for the literature included within the piece of pre-appraised evidence was conducted. Most pre-appraised evidence is published several years after the investigators have searched the literature and synthesized the research from which the pre-appraised piece of evidence was developed. Also, do not get put off by older evidence and research that was used to build the piece of pre-appraised evidence. Remember, the use of seminal work is often appropriate when analyzing a topic because this type of evidence can be used to establish a background for the topic and can provide a foundation for the topic, or it may demonstrate highly impactful and influential findings in the development of the topic and how to address the topic. While age is important, it must be considered from all of these angles. The second part of determining suitability is to identify the topic specifics from the piece of pre-appraised evidence and analyze how closely these specifics align with your evidence-based practice question. You should recall from learning about building an evidence-based practice question that evidence-based practice question should include a group of interest, often referred to as the population, the intended intervention, where the solution would need to be implemented, often referred to as the setting, and what outcome is going to be evaluated. A suitable piece of pre-appraised evidence should cover the same concepts as your evidence-based practice question. If the concepts are not exactly the same, they should be similar enough that translation from the pre-appraised piece of evidence to your evidence-based practice topic would be considered reasonable. Let's now take some time to look at how we would use the tools in Appendix E1 to determine the suitability of a piece of pre-appraised evidence. On this slide, I have copied the part of the pre-appraised evidence appraisal tool in Appendix E1 from the Johns Hopkins evidence-based practice model that addresses suitability. Before you address the quality of a pre-appraised piece of evidence, you should always begin by appraising the suitability of the piece of evidence. This is because if a piece of evidence is deemed not suitable, there is no reason to move forward with an appraisal of quality. Because evidence that is not suitable should not be used to guide practice change, as there is not enough support for this evidence being relevant to addressing your evidence-based practice question. Over the next few slides, we will review each suitability appraisal question in detail, working through exactly what each question is asking so you best know how to answer the questions and provide rationale for how you came to the conclusions you reached. Remember, appraising for suitability is a subjective process, but using a standardized tool such as Appendix E1 helps to streamline that process. The first suitability appraisal question asks, is the topic or intervention the same or similar to the topic of interest? This question is addressing two concepts, topic and intervention. First, look at the topic. What were the investigators of this piece of pre-appraised evidence interested in? Is there enough resemblance between their topic and your evidence-based practice question topic that their topic can be considered relevant and applicable to your topic? In other words, how well does their topic relate or align with yours? In some cases, the two topics may be identical. Similar topics would address part of what your topic is addressing, or possibly address all that your topic is addressing, plus address some additional considerations. Next, look at the intervention from the piece of pre-appraised evidence, if there is an intervention. What was done in the pieces of evidence that comprised and formed the larger piece of pre-appraised evidence to address the problem? Was an experiment done? How was it done? You want to look at if the intervention used in the evidence addresses the same problem you are addressing in your evidence-based practice question, and if the intervention uses a comparable approach to the one you intend to use. The same intervention would be addressing an identical question with an identical approach. Similar would be addressing part of your question or addressing your question plus other considerations using an approach that is not identical to your approach but includes aspects of your approach. The second suitability question asks, is the population the same or similar to your population of interest? Your population is who your intended participants or subjects of interest are. You want to appraise if the population from the piece of pre-appraised evidence is the same or similar to that population. We want the populations to align. In other words, the populations need to be similar enough that the evidence can be reasonably applied from the population of the piece of pre-appraised evidence to your population. A perfect match for population is very, very rare. It is highly unlikely that you will find pre-appraised evidence where the investigators studied the exact same population that you are addressing in your evidence-based practice problem. However, we do want to look for close alignment. Some considerations. Maybe the piece of evidence has a population that includes your population as part of the overall population. You will want to consider if the evidence provides specific information for your population and what percentage of the total population studied or investigated is your population. This is a judgment call that you will have to make and be able to justify. The third question asks, is the setting the same or similar to your setting of interest? The setting is the context in which the intervention was studied and should be comparable to the setting of your evidence-based practice problem. Sometimes the setting for a piece of pre-appraised evidence may be broad, such as addressing all inpatient clinical settings. This setting would be deemed similar if your evidence-based practice problem setting was inpatient, but not similar if your evidence-based practice setting was outpatient. Again, determining if the setting is the same or similar can be quite subjective. The fourth question asks, if applicable, are the outcomes the same or similar to your outcomes of interest? Outcomes refers to what was measured in the studies comprising the piece of pre-appraised evidence. Ideally, outcomes that were measured should be the same outcomes that you intend to measure when addressing your evidence-based practice problem. Outcomes does not mean that you get the same measurements, just that you are measuring the same phenomena. Similar outcomes would be those pieces of evidence that are measuring only some of what you intend to measure, or those pieces of evidence that are measuring what you intend to measure plus measuring additional phenomena. If the piece of evidence is otherwise the same as yours, but measuring items beyond what you intended to measure, this may be an indicator that maybe you should consider measuring the other criteria that the pre-appraised evidence measured as well. Notice this question says, if applicable. If there were no outcomes discussed, and if you do not intend to measure outcomes for your evidence-based practice project, then you can simply check the box for not applicable. However, if there were no outcomes discussed and you intend to measure outcomes, then the answer is no. The outcomes are not the same or similar. The fifth question asks, how recent are the references? And there's a notation to provide dates. When we look at references, we want to look at both the individual pieces of evidence that were appraised to form the pre-appraised piece of evidence, as well as the references that are referred to in the background and introduction section as part of a literature review, as well as the references that were used for comparison to the findings from the pre-appraised evidence in the discussion section. I would encourage you to take separate notes for the different types of references. The articles that were appraised, what was their date range? And the articles used in the literature review or discussion section, what was their date range? Depending on how large it is, you may have year and number of articles or year span in number of articles. The sixth and final question asks, are references recent enough to be reasonably applied to your practice setting? And there's a notation that this will depend on the intervention and changing nature of the topic at hand. This question is appraising if the piece of pre-appraised evidence does indeed contain the most up-to-date evidence on your topic. To answer this question, you should refer back to question number 5, where you looked at the ages of the references, as well as consider if your topic is a static topic or an evolving topic. Remember, for static topics, older references may be completely appropriate, as there likely isn't much new information on the topic being generated. For evolving topics, however, depending on the exact nature of the topic, you are going to want evidence that was published very recently, and there is probably a high likelihood that at least 1 or 2 studies have been published since the piece of pre-appraised evidence was completed. Once you get through the 6 suitability questions on the tool, you should note there is a space for notes. No pun intended. Consider this a place to jot down reminders to yourself. On this slide, I have included a few suggestions of the types of reminders you should jot down. First, clarification for the difference between the piece of pre-appraised evidence and your evidence-based practice question for any of the appraisal questions that you answered as similar but not the same. If I was using this tool, I would circle either similar or the same on the question, and then add notes for what differences existed in any answer that I marked as similar. Second, if you answer something other than yes for any of the appraisal questions, jot yourself a note of the rationale for why the answer was no, unclear, or non-applicable. Third, once you determine the overall suitability of your piece of pre-appraised evidence, write down this selection, because if the pre-appraised piece of evidence was deemed either suitable or not fully suitable, you're going to continue to the quality appraisal. So you may not recall later if you appraised the evidence as suitable or not fully suitable, and that will impact the ability of the evidence to be used as independent support for decision making. So you really want to know how you appraise the suitability. And fourth, I suggest, so that you do remember things, that you include anything important about the suitability of the piece of pre-appraised evidence that you are afraid you may forget tomorrow. The appraisal process tends to be a long process, so don't just assume you're going to remember the details. The more you write down now, the less you are going to have to go back and the less repeat work you're going to have to do to try to recall why you appraised this piece of evidence the way you did later on during the process. Before we jump into quality appraisal, I want to discuss an action item tip related to suitability. It is possible that a single piece of pre-appraised evidence may not provide sufficient comprehensive information for practice change. A piece of pre-appraised evidence may provide sufficient information to inform what the best practice change should be, but depending on the topic and the focus of the piece of pre-appraised evidence, key information such as how to implement the change may not have been addressed in the piece of pre-appraised evidence. If you find a piece of pre-appraised evidence provides ample support for practice change, but is lacking in the guidance of how to move forward with a comprehensive and informed practice change, you are going to need to develop a secondary evidence-based practice question to answer that essential step before beginning the process of translation. Remember, any additional evidence-based practice questions that you generate as a result of the critical appraisal process are going to require additional investigation. This is not to discourage you from asking these additional questions as you go through the critical appraisal process. You should ask these questions. I want you to ask these questions. Asking these questions is what is going to ensure that your practice change will be the best informed practice change that it can be. Before we end this lecture, let's recap what we have discussed about the critical appraisal of suitability for pre-appraised evidence. Remember, you should always appraise suitability before appraising quality. If the piece of evidence is not suitable for answering your evidence-based practice question, the quality of the piece of evidence becomes irrelevant. When you are assessing suitability, try not to get bogged down by the terminology. The Johns Hopkins model does have an evidence terminology and considerations log in Appendix F that you can review if terms are confusing. Remember, though, that the purpose of appraising suitability is to determine if the recommendations for practice change and best practice provided in the piece of pre-appraised evidence are appropriate for implementation in your environment. When you are appraising suitability, you have three options: suitable, not fully suitable, or not suitable. Suitable means your entire evidence-based practice question was completely addressed by the piece of pre-appraised evidence. Not fully suitable means the piece of pre-appraised evidence did not completely address your evidence-based practice question, but at least informed your evidence-based practice question. Not suitable means that the piece of pre-appraised evidence was not similar enough to your evidence-based practice question to be considered relevant and applicable for guiding practice change. Evidence that is suitable or not fully suitable should be appraised for quality. Evidence that is not suitable should be discarded. And finally, don't expect that you will remember the details of your appraisal, so use the notes section of Appendix E to document your rationale. In the next lecture, we will begin our discussion on how to appraise quality of pre-appraised evidence. I will catch you then.